The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon or good morning, whichever it is for you, or even evening for the Lunch and Learn. And this is module number 2, which is enhancing your personal influence. So welcome. I think you'll enjoy today's presentation. If you've completed the influencing capabilities profile, it would be useful because obviously this is a debrief on that. But don't despair if you haven't got around to doing your profile, then I suggest you do that immediately because then it'll make a lot of sense to you. And then you, just so that you understand, when you go in, I have to agree or approve that, then you can print off and get your results, which is always very interesting. People have great feedback about the results, and some people are quite surprised. Some people are it confirms what they already knew about their the way they like to persuade people. So that's the essence of today. Now, if you haven't done it, it's okay, because what will happen is that you will get an overview, and then you're doing it in a roundabout way, and then off you go and do it. But I do suggest you do it if you haven't already done so. All right, so let's get underway and look at the overview of the program. But just before I go any further, I just want to make sure I'm being heard. Could people please go to the question box on the right-hand side and just type in clear or something like that? I just need to know that I'm actually being heard, because otherwise I'm talking to myself, which is not a good thing necessarily. So could you just type in clear or something like that, just to let me know that I'm actually being heard? So could we do that, please? Thank you. All right. Thank you, Tom. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, John. Thanks, Kelly. Okay. All right. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is good and reassuring. So if we consider the thank you, yep, there's quite a few people coming in now. Thank you very much. What you're seeing on your screen right now, of course, is the program, the series in its entirety. Now, you would know, of course, that we've completed Unit 1, which was Ingredients of Effective Feedback, and I hope what's happened since the last time we spoke is that you've had a real opportunity to start giving some feedback to people, and particularly positive feedback. And I did set you the homework to go out of your way to find 3 opportunities where you could actually give people positive feedback. So I hope you've had an opportunity to do that. And just as last time we met 2 weeks ago, if you've got questions, if you've got comments, if you've got observations, type them in the question box there, please. Just remember, I'm the only one that sees the question. I will read the question out and I will respond to it as soon as I get it. In other words, we'll do it as interactively as we probably can all the way through and not leave it till the end. So as soon as you've got a statement or a question or something you want to ask, do so straight away and I'll get straight to it. All right, so we are obviously covering enhancing your personal influence today. And just to go through, we'll look at optimizing team performance in 2 weeks' time, and that's about getting the very best of the people you lead. And I know there's several of you in this Lunch and Learn series who probably work with a lot of volunteers, and of course that creates its own special issues as well, because they're doing it out of the love of it rather than being paid. So obviously optimizing them is slightly different, I guess, to people that are paid. Unit 4 will look at getting the very best out of people, and at the end of the day, I would suggest to you as a leader that this is one of your most important core responsibilities, is to get the very best from the people that you lead. And that doesn't necessarily mean you'll get them to 100%, but if they're, let's say, traveling at 60%, if you can get them to 70%, and someone else from 40 to 50, and someone else from 80 to 90, and so forth, then you're making good headway, and that's going to make a huge difference in terms of productivity. In Unit 5, I'll get you to do another diagnostic. This one isn't online. It'll be a paper version, and I'll send it through to you in my normal email distribution. And I'll get you to complete that before Module 5, Unit 5, because we'll look at understanding people and their personalities, and people often find this one of their favourites because it's a little bit of fun, and also there's a serious message behind it, and that is treat people how they want to be treated. Don't treat people how you want to be treated, and there's a big difference there. And in Unit 6, we'll look at facilitating effective meetings, and we will cover some of the things that work really well in meetings from my experience, and it'll give you an opportunity to practice some very practical applications and tools in your meetings. And I would suggest to you that being a leader, it's important to become good at running meetings. Why? Because you'll be doing a lot of them. It takes up a lot of time, costs a lot of money if you work out the hourly rate and so forth, plus the opportunity costs that are lost while people are sitting in a meeting. So it's very important you do that right, and that's the whole reason we're doing Unit 6. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview. Let's get stuck into Unit 2, enhancing your personal influence. Okay, now in this particular broadcast, I'm looking at achieving 4 things. First of all, I want us to understand what influence really is. And I think when you say the term influence, people think about manipulation or being cunning or underhanded or something like that. It's nothing of the sort, and I want to define what I mean by influence. I then want to talk about the influencing capabilities framework, which you would have been exposed to if you've completed your profile. And then I want to talk about the 4 influencing strategies, and the key for you is to try to use all 4, but the issue is that you're probably going to favour one of the 4, and that's what your profile will show you, and as a result of that you're probably using that too often. So we'll have a look at that, and then we'll look at some tools of influence, some very practical tools that you can apply immediately this afternoon, in fact, if indeed it is about lunchtime today where you are. All right, so that's what we're covering. So let's, and this should come up on your screen very shortly. There it is. You'll notice that there are 4 people on this screen, and I want you to have a think about what they've got in common. So what do these 4 people have in common? You might recognize some of them. You may not. The face might be familiar, but you can't put a name to them. But what have they all got in common? Well, they're all highly influential, or have been highly influential. 4 of them are dead, and one's still living. And what I'm going to do is use these 4 leaders to explain the 4 influencing strategies. And each of them have been highly influential in their lives. In fact, they've changed the course of history in some cases. Now, they aren't necessarily angels, and I think you'll find that people will have very strong reactions to them, either positive or negative. And I'm not putting them in there because they're personal heroes of mine, but they are in my book. And what they're really doing is, what they're really noted for is their capacity to change history. So in going clockwise, starting on the left-hand side at the top, we've got Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States and now climate change activist. We've got Dr. Martin Luther King, civil rights activist who wrote and gave one of the greatest speeches of all time, I Have a Dream. Former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain for 10 years, had made some significant change, and people have either loved or hated her depending on your political views. And then we've got Mother Teresa, who recently was anointed a saint by the Catholic Church, who was noted for her wonderful work in the streets of Calcutta and other very poverty-stricken areas of the world, where she was able to deal with people in homeless environments and who are poverty-stricken. So we're going to talk about each of these, and you'll notice that I'm being politically correct here. I've got 2 females, 2 males. I've got right-wingers and left-wingers. So I'm trying to cover the full gambit here and not to demonstrate any sort of bias in terms of my own views. But as I said, they're not personal heroes of mine necessarily, but the point about them is that they have enormous influence. And I think when you go through your profile, you'll find that you can click on the icons as you go through, and it'll give you a little video recording of each of these 4 people in action, and you can watch and see how they like, or how they liked to influence, or like to influence in one case. And it's very insightful to see that. So I'll be talking about those 4 as we go through the session this morning or today. Now, the first thing I do want to acknowledge is to give you a definition of influence. Now, as I said before, many people think influence means being manipulative or being cunning or underhanded or something. In my view, it's nothing of the sort. We are all in the business of influence, whether we believe it or not. We're all trying to influence our children, we're trying to influence our partner, we're trying to influence our boss, we're trying to influence our stakeholders, we're trying to influence our team. At the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. So what does it mean? It means that it is the power to make other people agree with your opinions or get them to do what you want willingly and ethically. So in other words, it could be about getting them to change the way they think or what they actually do, but to do it in a way where they're willing to do that, not just because you have suggested it to them, but that they can see the virtue in doing it. And you're doing it in a transparent and ethical way. In other words, it's not cunning or underhanded in any way, shape or form. So that's my definition of influence. And that's important that we get that clear up front. Now, when this slide comes up shortly on your screen, okay, I'm going to make this statement, and I think it's very important, and I've alluded to this. We are all in the business of influence. You are, I am, I'm trying to influence you today. You'll finish on this broadcast and you'll have something to do, and then you'll be wanting to influence somebody else about something. So we're all in that business, and we need to acknowledge that and understand that it's very, very important for us to try to be even more effective as an influencer. So it's important that we take that on board, because some people feel a little bit funny about that and say, oh, I'm not really in the business of influence. Yes, you are, and it's important that you get good at it because other people are trying to influence you anyway. So it's just the nature of how the world works. Okay, now there are 3 variables in any influencing situation, or 3 important key elements. And I want you to have a think about these. One of the key elements in any influencing or persuasive situation is that you have your own preferred style and approach. And how do you know what that is? Well, that's what the influencing capabilities profile does. It gives you a handle on what your preferred style and approach is. So obviously, if you have a preferred style and approach, you're obviously going to use it more regularly because that's what makes sense to you. You're making an assumption that what influences me, which would influence other people. So if you're influenced by fact and logic and structure, that's likely to be the case around how you're influencing other people. Now, the second variable is that other people have their own style and approach as well. Now, they probably haven't done the influencing capabilities profile, but they certainly have an orientation towards a particular way of being influenced. Now, if you influence them using your preferred style when they have a different style, it's likely to be less effective than you'd like. And we've all had cases where people's eyes have glazed over when you're trying to explain something to people, and you try even harder to influence them by using your preferred style and approach. The trick for you and me is to alter our style and approach, and that's what the influencing capabilities framework does. It gives you a kind of train track to run on. And of course, there's a third element in all this, and that is the context. That's the situation that you're in. For example, if you've got very little time, it's probably not an opportunity to collaborate. If you want to win the hearts and minds of people, well, maybe that is a time when you need to spend more time collaborating. So each of those things are important. Now, we don't sit there and think, my goodness, what's my style? What are their styles? What's the context? We don't do that. It's virtually impossible to do that because we're in the moment. But here's the thing. If you find that your approach isn't working, then what you need to do is to move to a plan B or a plan C or a plan D. And that's what I'm intending to do during this presentation. All right. So what you're going to see on your screen very shortly is the influencing capabilities framework. Now, if you've completed the diagnostic, you'd already be exposed to this because it's part of your report. But if you look at the diagnostic on your screen, you'll notice it's a pretty simple model. And one of the reasons I put this model together in my book, The New Influencing Toolkit, was that I was concerned that there wasn't much out there on influence. At one end of the scale, there was a lot of academic work on it that really didn't make a lot of practical sense or application. And then at the other end of the continuum, we have a lot of sales type books and publications, and those books and publications are not always applicable to the work of leadership. So my thinking was I need to put something together that kind of is in the middle between those two extremes. So what you're seeing in front of you is the product of that. And you'll see that up the top there is a push and a pull style. Let me explain what a push and a pull style is. You will notice I've put up on the screen there some I guess, definitions of what a push and a pull style is. Now, in your influencing capabilities framework, you'll get a score for push and a score for pull, and that will tell you which one you favour. But the push style is very much a more directive, very much a giving information, taking the idea to the person type of approach. Whereas the pull style is more a collaborative, seeking information, working with and through other people, enabling others, and so forth. So now you might say, well, which is better? Well, it depends on the situation, and it also depends on who you're trying to influence. And in other words, using them both are critically important. But if you've got a very high score in one as distinct from the other, it probably suggests that you're using that perhaps a little bit too often, and what you probably need to do is to alter your style so that you can be a bit more flexible. So in other words, if I walked up to anyone that you were actually working with and said, which are they? Are they push or pull? The answer that you'd actually want is, well, in actual fact, they're both. It depends on what's happening at the time. But you don't necessarily want them to say, oh no, she uses the pull style, or he's very much a push style, because already you've been typecast, and it means that you've limited your capabilities to be able to be flexible and to change. Now the other two on the left-hand side, you've got logical approach and emotional approach. So let me talk a little bit about that. And in a minute, you'll have that up on your screen, which is a kind of definition of both. So people who are very logical or tend to rely on facts and evidence and rationale, they like structure and they like measurement. And those that are emotional in their approach are probably more into feelings and perceptions and values. They're more flexible, And so when you look at your influencing capabilities profile, which is higher? Is it the logical approach or is it the emotional approach? And again, my suggestion is to try to develop the score that's the lowest. In other words, there are certain circumstances that require logic and there are certain circumstances that require emotion. And both are important, and of course you interact with people who favour one or the other of those approaches, and you need to be flexible and adaptable to situations that you're confronted with. Now, what all that does, of course, is it brings up 4 different influencing strategies. So investigation, which is a logical approach using a push style. Motivation, which is an emotional approach using a push style. Calculation, which is a logical approach using a pull style. And collaboration, which is an emotional approach using a pull style. Now, the profile will show you which of those 4 dominates in terms of working with and through other people. So that will show you what your preferred style is, and probably what's happening is that you're using that particular strategy too often. And what I suggest to you is to try to use the other 3 more often so that you can influence more people, depending, of course, on who you're trying to influence. Okay, so if you've got any questions or comments at this stage, you know what to do. Just go to the question box and type in your question or comment, and I'll respond to it immediately. All right, so in your influencing capabilities profile, you'll have a page like this. And on this page, you'll notice that there are a lot of percentages. So what is different to the previous page that I've shown you is that you've got 4 capabilities underpinning each of the influencing strategies. So for example, in investigation, there's gathering evidence, countering arguments, assert ideas, and generate ideas. There are 4 capabilities that underpin each of those strategies. So what I suggest you do is, if you haven't already done so, is have a good look at your results. And what you need to do is to look at some of your lower and higher scores relative to the other scores. So for example, if you look at the profile that's in front of you right now, you'll notice that down in the bottom left-hand corner, which is motivation, you'll notice that this person has got 40% for connecting emotionally. So compared with all of the other 15 capabilities, that's the lowest. So my advice to that person would be to start working on building connections emotionally, because obviously that's something that's not their strong suit. But on the other hand, if you look up in the top left-hand corner under the investigation strategy, this person has gathering evidence at 83%. So the argument is perhaps they are relying a little bit too much on gathering evidence, and perhaps that might at times impede them because they might be working with people who perhaps aren't all that interested in gathering evidence, and there are such people. Another one there, you'll notice that there's 85% on giving feedback, so that's obviously a strong suit, but it can also be a double-edged sword that perhaps this person might be relying on giving feedback too often, and as a result of that, perhaps they should be doing other things. And if they do that, of course, they become more influential. All right, so that's a very valuable page in your profile, and I'd ask you to just circle the ones that you have low scores on and start working to try to improve your capabilities in those areas. So let's talk now about the 4 strategies, and I'd like to start with the investigator. And I use the word inquisitive because that's an adjective that sort of describes what an investigator does. The investigators really like to marshal facts and figures, and they like to assert and advance their arguments. So they'll use logic and persuasion, and they'll tend to be very methodical and structured in their approach. And the best example of those four famous characters I mentioned at the outset of the presentation was Al Gore. Al Gore, of course, was Vice President of the United States, and you might recall in 2000 he lost that very famous election against George W. Bush. In fact, it was decided in the courts because of a lot of controversy in the Florida elections and the outcomes of that, and particularly the process that it was conducted under. But nevertheless, he reinvented himself after that and became a climate change activist. And you'll find that there's a very good video called The Inconvenient Truth on YouTube that you might like to have a look at. And you'll notice that he uses facts and figures and logic relentlessly to make his point about global warming. So notwithstanding whether we agree or disagree, the point is that he used investigation as an influencing strategy when he put together that approach. So he's a good example, and on your influencing capabilities profile, if you go on the page on investigation and click on the icon, it will show you that a clip of that presentation, The Inconvenient Truth. All right, so let's have a look at this a little bit further. So, what professions out there are perhaps geared up for investigation? Well, if you think about it, police and scientists and researchers, their whole career is very much vested in the idea of collecting evidence and then proving a particular hypothesis. So police will collect evidence in order to have a watertight case for a conviction before the courts. Scientists and researchers will attempt to do rigorous research to validate or refute a hypothesis. So there are professions out there that are very much inclined towards that. Now, when you would use this as a particular influencing strategy would be in workplace incidents such as safety or harassment. Where there is an investigation that's required in the workplace, the idea would be that you would go out and do a rigorous investigation, you would put together a report, and that report would probably have some credibility on the basis that you have done your homework and collected some evidence. Right, so that's where you would use it. That's not the only place you'd use it, but that's one place that you could use it. But where you wouldn't use it would be, for example, in large-scale change initiatives when you want people to be on board. So where you want to win the hearts and minds of people, facts, figures, and logic is probably not going to do it. So you need to talk about the big picture, why we're doing this, what's in it for the people, and how everybody will benefit. And of course, that's not investigation. So you can see that there are times and places when these things can be used and when they shouldn't be used. So let's move on to the second, is calculation. Now, calculation, the adjective that I use there to describe it is clear. Calculators are very clear about their expectations of other people. And what calculators do is they promote the positives of a proposal overtly, and they highlight the weaknesses in the current position. So people know exactly where they stand with calculators. They use logic to advance their cause, but generally calculators are very good debaters. And calculators, of course, are very vested in key performance indicators, will point out to people process. They want people to follow due process. So if you had a high score in calculation, that will probably ring true for you. And the famous person that demonstrates that clearly is Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was highly controversial when she was the Prime Minister. People either loved or hated her. In fact, there were people who were celebrating on her death. And she may evoke a certain emotion in you too. But there's no question about it that people knew precisely where they stood with her, because she was clear about what she was trying to achieve, whether we agreed with it or not, and she would also point out the weaknesses of the current position or the opposition. So if you think about a good school teacher that you had, that's exactly what they've done. They knew there was a line in the sand, and you knew not to cross it. And of course, you gained a respect for them as a result of that. So who does that? Well, salespeople are very prone to using calculation to sell their products or services. For example, the other day I walked past Harvey Norman's, and there was a sign outside Harvey Norman's, and it said 40% off laptops today, which obviously sparked my attention. I wasn't thinking of buying a laptop, but I thought, you know what? I'll go in and have a look, because a 40% reduction is substantial. When I walked through the door, there was another sign that said, must purchase the laptops by close of business today to receive your 40% discount. So you see what they have done? They talked up the benefits, which was, of course, the 40% discount. And when I walked through the door, they also talked about the fact that I had to make a decision that day. So sales is very much will use this calculation strategy. Financial advisors are the same. This is the very best deal going, and you really need to get in on the ground floor, is their mantra often. Animal trainers, if you go to a circus and you're watching the animal trainer train the horses to do their great feats, you'll notice the ponies, you'll notice what they do is they've got a whip in one hand and a pocket full of treats in the other, and they will alternate between using the whip and the treats in order to get the ponies to do their impressive feats. Teachers, as I mentioned before, are in that business as well, and children need to know where boundaries are, and good teachers actually give children boundaries. Now, where you would use this in your workplace is any new change in the workplace that will affect actually employees, the people that work with you, and how they work. So that might require you to sell the positives of that. So, for example, it might be talking about harassment and bullying legislation training, and many people might just think that's a waste of time. They need to know why they're doing it. You need to explain the benefits of it, and also to point out the pitfalls of not doing it. And if you do that the right way, of course, you may convince them that it's actually in their interest to do that particular training. Now, where you wouldn't use it is in situations where the direction is vague and unclear. So if your belief we should create a new market for a product, for example, if you're in the private sector, well, what you need to do is to explain to the people in your working environment why you think that's a good market, and then talk about the negatives of not taking advantage of that new market. So it leverages people across the positives and the negatives. All right, let's move on to the third style, which is the mindful motivator. So if you've got any questions, guys, go ahead. I'll stop. I don't feel shy. That's what this is about, and I'll respond as well as I can. Here's another form of motivation, form of influence. Now, this is below the line. So these next two are using emotion and not logic to influence. So motivators will use emotion to influence. So they're big picture thinkers. And what they'll do is they'll link a cause with a compelling vision. So they'll often have a way with words, and they can define a simple and compelling vision. Martin Luther King, of course, as I said earlier, had a magnificent speech called I Have a Dream. And if you haven't actually had a chance to look at it, I suggest you do in your influencing profile, because It was a magnificent speech, but it had absolutely no fact in it whatsoever. It was all rhetoric, beautiful words and beautiful phrases, a very, very fine speech. And of course, it was a speech that moved a nation, moved a generation, and probably could be categorized as one of the greatest speeches of all time. So Martin Luther King, of course, was a mindful motivator. Now, who in what occupations, use motivation? Well, entrepreneurs. So an Elon Musk or a Richard Branson, they are entrepreneurs, and what they are is big picture thinkers. They think about the big picture, and what they do is they sell that big picture, and what happens is they surround themselves with people that get excited about that big picture and help that entrepreneur make that big picture a reality. So you've got advertising executives that have only got a split second with you to try to convince you to buy their goods or services. So they use emotion, don't they, when you're watching a television ad? Public relations agents, artistic directors who are putting on a show will talk about the show must go on and the big picture of how we might achieve the end result. So where you would use this would be where you're developing a new strategic direction for your team or your business, and it requires you winning hearts and minds. So if it requires winning hearts and minds, then you really have to use motivation. Now, you don't have to be a great orator like Martin Luther King. You can tell stories. You can paint a picture by telling a story. But where you shouldn't use this is where you're unclear about the rationale of the new initiative. So if people all of a sudden are exposed to budget cuts in your organisation, they basically want to know why the budget cuts are being made and where they're being made. That's what they want. In other words, they need facts, figures, and logic, which of course is underpinning the investigation strategy. Once they've understood all that, then they might be prepared to look at a big picture, but they're not interested in that until they understand why. So, of course, if you use these things in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people, you won't get the response that you want. Okay, moving on. And finally, the last of the 4 influencing strategies is the collegial collaborator. So collegial collaborators will have a tendency to influence using emotion, but what they do is they persuade people by involving them in the decision-making process. So collaborators are actually great team builders. They engage people's hearts and minds, and you can see on your screen one person that has done that has been Mother Teresa. And of course, her mission in her life leading to sainthood was to go into the streets of Calcutta and other poor places around the world and feed the starving. And of course, like all the other leaders that I'm talking about, she has her detractors too. But the bottom line is she did some wonderful work. And to do that work, she was requiring people from NGOs and government agencies and wealthy donors and volunteers to come together to work as a team. So her style was very much around collaborating, getting volunteers involved and marshalling their passion to get the job done in this very noble quest. So you can see that Mother Teresa very much exhibits that collaborator influencing strategy. All right, so if you think about careers that are closely aligned with that, you've got conductors of orchestras. They don't play a musical instrument. A conductor just stands at the front of the orchestra, generally with their back to the audience, and often they don't even have a baton in their hand, and basically they orchestrate or collaborate a beautiful ensemble using all the sections of the orchestra. So they're basically collaborating with artistic people to create a beautiful sound. Funeral directors, of course, have got to collaborate with a bunch of stakeholders that perhaps don't want to be there and involved, and they've got to do it in a way that brings it all together. So that requires collaboration. Choreographers have to deal with lots of people with high egos, and so they've got to work closely and building relationships up and getting people to all work towards a common cause. So where you wouldn't use this is where you would use this is in circumstances where there are diverse and strongly held views. So if you've got a team where there's a strong view this way and a strong view that way about anything, the best thing that you could probably do is to get that out on the table, not sweep it under the carpet, and actually have a meeting and ask people if they'd come to the meeting being prepared to discuss their point of view. Set a couple of ground rules, such as don't interrupt people when they're saying what they need to say, and hear them out, and suspend judgment. So you make a couple of rules, and then you let people share their point of view. And by doing that, you are collaborating towards a common cause. Because if you don't do that, what happens is it goes underground, and of course those views are solidified, and before you know it, people are entrenched in their point of view. So where you wouldn't use it is where you need some logic, you need a rationale behind a decision. So for example, if your organisation was introducing a new customer relationship system tomorrow, and people were jumping up and down about that because they're used to using an old system, they want to know, why are we using this new system, which is a fair question. And so you need to give them the facts and the logic behind why they've moved from a current system to a new system. And once that's done, you can then collaborate with them around how they might make that new system work effectively for them. So you can see that they can be used in different forums. So in your influencing capabilities profile, you will get a slide, or you get a page like this. I think I mentioned this before, which shows your percentages. It also gives you a little bit of a definition at the bottom as to what each influencing strategy consists of, and you can have a think and strategize about how you might improve some of the lower scores relative and use some of the higher scores to your advantage, but not to overdo them, of course. All right, now let's talk about a couple of strategies that might help you and to build on these 4 influencing capabilities or 4 influencing strategies. So if you want to improve your ability to investigate in terms of influence, use third-party endorsements. What I mean by that is, if you've got someone that's highly respected in your industry or even in your organization who has walked the walk, in other words, they've achieved what you want to achieve in your team, if you can get them to come and address the team, it's even better. But if you can't, then refer to them and get them, use their name, put them in the report, and then it adds instant credibility because everyone knows that that person's well respected. Structured interviews, of course, when we interview people for jobs, we tend to use structured interviews, and we do that for a reason, so that we can defend our decision at the end and be very valid, and that's what we do. So using structured interviews is a very useful way of using investigation. Of course, any survey that's useful and well put together has enormous influence. In fact, that's why we're surveyed out, because surveys themselves can give us a clear message very simply at the end, and it can be highly influential. Certainly politicians, for example, are quite, even though they say they don't, they will look at the opinion polls when they're published, because they have high influence in terms of their own political careers. And of course, processing mapping is very effective. What's the process map? Well, you can see one on your screen. That's where you might map out a process from going from A to B, so something that you do in your workplace. And if you do this with your team, you're incorporating collaboration with investigation. And whenever you can combine 2 of these strategies together, it's even more powerful. So you actually go through that, and then you ask your team to identify where the pinch points are in the process, and then you work collaboratively with your team to try to improve those difficult parts of a process. All right. So there's 4 that can be very, very useful for you. Now, moving on to calculation. Calculation, there's 3 things that you can do there that are very, very effective if you've got a low score there. One is you could use a force field analysis, and a force field analysis was invented by Kurt Lewin. He became famous for just drawing a line down the center of a page. So on the left-hand side, he would write all the driving forces for change, and on the right-hand side, he'd write all the restraining forces for change. So you pick an issue and what are all the driving forces, what are all the restraining forces? And again, if you do this with your team, it becomes even more influential because you're combining collaboration with calculation. And then you can perhaps give each of the driving forces a rating out of 5 in terms of how powerful a force it is, and you can give each of the restraining forces on the right-hand side a score out of 5 depending on how powerful it is in restraining the change. And then you can work out what you might do about maximizing the driving forces and minimizing the restraining forces. Any cost-benefit analysis is a calculation tool. That's where you explain the costs associated with change, but then you articulate what the benefits are. And if the benefits clearly outweigh the costs, then it's likely to be an influential proposal. Then again, if the costs outweigh the benefits, it's likely that the proposal won't get up. So that can be a very powerful way to make a case. And of course, an after-action review is very powerful. The military use after-action reviews quite a lot. What's an after-action review? Well, it's based on 3 questions, and these are the questions. So after you've completed a project or an activity or something with your team, perhaps it's an interaction with a client or the member of public or something, you say, what went well? And again, if you use this collaboratively, you're combining calculation and collaboration. What went well? Always start with the positives. And the reason for that is that it starts an upward spiral of positivity to start with. Now, even if it was a disaster, there must have been something that went well. And then once you've exhausted what went well, then move on to the second question, which is what didn't go well? Because inevitably, even if it seemed like a perfect project, there's probably some things that didn't go well. And then the third question you pose to the team is, what will we do differently as a result of what we've learnt? Very powerful. And it really does stagger me how few people use an after-action review, or what's short for AAR, in their workplace. Certainly the military will use it. Are you using it? And if you're not, you probably should. And it only takes 5-10 minutes. The lessons that come out of it, we can all agree on, and you'll find that people will pretty much be adhered to the lessons because people don't argue with their own data. All right, moving on to motivation. In motivation, here's some strategies that might work for you. If you've got a new team and you're trying to create harmony in the team, how about you use a team values charter? How do you use it? You ask them 4 questions. You get them to write the answers down in a team meeting. Question 1 is, if there was one value that was important to you in working with this team, what would it be? That's the question, right? You get them to actually write it down. So they might write down respect, for example. Question 2 is define what you mean by, or what does your value mean? So I might say respect means that we pay attention and respect the views of our team members even when we don't agree. Again, get people to write it down. Question 3 is, why is it important to you? So that's always good to know what the motivation is behind the values that people hold close. bearing in mind motivation is an emotional strategy, not a logical. And the fourth question is, what behaviours would demonstrate that value? So I might say respect means that we don't interrupt people when they're in the middle of making a point in a team meeting. See how that works? Really good. GROW model. GROW stands for goal, reality, options, and where to from here. We don't have time to run through that in great detail, but if you are interested, just Google GROW or GROW model, and you'll get a whole lot of very interesting information that will help you in terms of improving your ability to motivate people. Tell a story. Stories are very powerful, particularly if they're stories that talk about something that you did wrong or made a mistake in the past. So, for example, if I was saying to somebody, if somebody came to me advice, and I said to them, "What would be your advice as a consultant?" I would say to them, perhaps, that you should do your homework and understand how the business or organisation operates before you go out and see them. Now, that's kind of like a lecture if I say that. It is good advice, but the question is it influential? Probably not. But if I told them a story about when I didn't actually do my homework and how I was humiliated, then it's more likely to stick. So storytelling's great. And again, you don't have to be as articulate as Martin Luther King. And of course, good news stories. Why don't you start your meetings with that? Why don't you go around the room and say, what's your one win for the week, assuming you have weekly meetings? You start first and just get each person to mention a win for the week. That creates a positive meeting environment. You're going to be talking about all the negative stuff anyway, but what a great opportunity to get people on the front foot. And of course, some people you'll find very interestingly will sit there scratching their head thinking, oh, I can't think of anything that went well for the week, which is pretty tragic, isn't it? So it trains people to start thinking about positives, which is always useful. Okay, and finally, in collaboration, let's talk about some of the things that you can do to improve your ability to collaborate. Do what Stephen Covey, the late Stephen Covey, said in his great book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and that is begin with the end in mind. So what he was basically saying is that you can hold a team meeting. You could say to your team, what I hope to get in the next 45 minutes of discussion is X. And I'd like you to move towards that goal and let's talk about X. And then you allow the team to collaborate on how they might reach X during the next 40 or so minutes. So you don't have to say much, you just have to keep people on track and make sure that they're following through on what it is that you want them to achieve. Giving effective feedback, which of course was Unit 1 in our Lunch and Learn series, is a critically important collaboration tool. By giving feedback, you are collaborating with people because you're engaging with them. Using a problem-solving approach, going through and working with other people using a problem-solving approach is a good idea. Active listening and paraphrasing to actually do that is a critically important skill. So if you do those things, you're likely to be more likely to engage your people in that collaborative process. And again, check out your influencing capabilities profile to see where you need to do some work. So guys, that's pretty much towards the end of our presentation today. I've covered what influence is. I've talked about the influencing capabilities framework. I've used 4 famous people to explain the 4 influencing strategies, and I've shared with you some tools. Now, you probably can work out what the homework is, but I've just got a question here, and I'm just going to read it out because it's a very good question. If you are going to do a presentation, which of the 4 influencing strategies would you use? Excellent question. That's a great question. And the answer to that, of course, is all 4. So let's say you've got to give a presentation. Maybe it's to your team, maybe it's in the community, maybe it's to other people in the organisation, whoever it might be. You don't know for sure who's going to be in the room. Of course, you know their names, but you don't necessarily know what their profile is. So the rule of thumb is that you should be trying to use all 4. So, for example, you would give some facts up front. So this is perhaps a proposal where you're wanting to get people to be persuaded. So you might give some facts. So you explain the facts of the situation. So I'm now starting off by using investigation. Once I've used some facts, I might then link my proposal or my change initiative with the strategic direction of the organisation. So I make a conscious link between my proposal and perhaps the vision of your organisation. So now I'm using motivation. I might then also ask for feedback. So I engage in a conversation with my team by taking questions, depends on how large the group is, and engaging them so it's not a one-way presentation. By doing that, I'm using collaboration. And then I might finish up my presentation by putting a slide up which says, here are all the benefits of my proposal, 1, 2, 3, 4. And should we not go down this road, here are some significant drawbacks for us not to take this initiative on board. I've now used calculation. So how could you not be influential by using those 4? So next time, that's a great question. So next time you've got a presentation, just start designing your presentation around the 4 influencing capabilities, and the chances are you'll hit the mark because everyone in that room will have one of those 4 predispositions: investigation, calculation, motivation, or collaboration. And by using that, you will be effective. All right, so next time we meet, which is in 2 weeks, we'll be looking at optimizing team performance. And of course, like always, I've got some homework for you, and I want you to apply this the moment you sign out of this broadcast. But I'd like you to complete the profile if you haven't, and implement at least one of the tools you've learnt. So basically what I want you to do now is to start exercising your influence by using some of the things that you feel least confident about. So for example, if you had a low score in investigation comparative to the other 3, then I think you should be starting to use facts and figures and logic far more so when you're actually working with and through other people. And bear in mind, influence is upward, sideways and downwards. What I mean by that is you're trying to influence your boss, you're trying to influence your team members, and you're probably trying to influence your stakeholders. So all of these things are applicable. So thanks, guys. I have enjoyed working with you today. Doesn't look like there are any other questions, but that was a ripper, the one that was asked there before. Thank you. I look forward to our next meeting, and I would ask you to exercise your influence. So thanks, guys. I wish you all the very best for the weekend. Thank you.